So I'm really happy to present some of the main findings in my book. But what I would like to particularly stress, as the title of my talk suggests, that we really need a totally different way of thinking about migration. So my book addresses, which has been translated in several languages. I still hope to find a Ukrainian publisher. So if you have any context, please let me know. But it's being translated in 14 languages. And of course, I'm very happy about it, because what I tried in the book is to convey insights from a century of migration research into sort of accessible language to a much bigger public, because as you all know, we are receiving a lot of propaganda and misinformation about migration, particularly from politics. But I would also say that most media reporting, even if it's with good intentions, gives a quite biased view of migration. I'll come back to those biases later on. But what I tried in the book is to tackle 22 different myths that we often hear about migration. But my actual purpose with the book is to really bring home this idea that we really need a totally different paradigm, a totally different way of thinking about migration to start with. And yeah, that's really my broader goal and mission in terms of what I try to convey to a bigger public. So yeah, we need a new migration paradigm. Now, of course, you'd ask me, what should that paradigm look like? And to summarize in a very, very short sentence, but I'll make sure during this talk that I give plenty of examples, and I hope towards the end of the talk it is a little bit more concrete what I'm trying to say. That if we really want to have a scientific understanding of migration that is based on evidence and facts, then we are compelled to reconceptualize migration as an intrinsic part of much bigger processes of social transformation and development, instead of the dominant framing of migration as something we need to fix, a problem we need to fix. Whether we talk about migration from poor to rich countries, whether we talk about refugees, the policy narrative is very much focused on solving problems. Now, of course, I'm all too much in favor of solving problems, but if the underlying assumption is that we can somehow think or wish away migration, then we tend to develop policies that are either ineffective or totally counterproductive, that make migrants suffer and actually don't solve any long-term problems. On the contrary, and I give some examples as well, they often lead to counterproductive results. But there is also this other view, right, that migration is a solution to problems. Like, you can often hear pro-immigration advocates saying that, yeah, we need migration to solve aging problems, to kickstart our economy, to bring growth and prosperity. I would say that is also a very biased perspective, and both perspectives are not really based on a real understanding of migration. Now, I hesitate to share this cliche with you, but I think it is important to share it again and take it seriously, which is that migration is obviously of all times. People have always migrated. It's always been part of the human condition in many ways. So we've always migrated, we're still migrating, and we will also be migrating in the future. But it's a very serious observation, because it pushes us to normalize our views on migration instead to pathologize them, which has been the dominant frame. Another problem with the contemporary framing of migration is this, in particularly in the political sphere, is the pro versus anti framing. And that is as problematic as the other biases, because you cannot be against or in favor of migration. It would be like, asking an economist whether he or she is against markets, or ask a meteorologist whether you're against or in favor of the climate. And I can go on and on and on. It reveals a failure to, in a way, accept the fact that migration has always been part and parcel of our human condition, particularly when societies are in rapid transition. And you could say that over the last 2 centuries, the way we lived have completely changed. We've moved from a rural, agrarian kind of society, peasant society by and large, to modern urban-based societies. And this is the fundamental transformation that we could also call the modern transformation, where intellectuals like Karl Polanyi have written about extensively, which meant a complete reorganization of our societies and our economies. Now, there's no way you can imagine that transfer, that transition, without large-scale population movement. So what it shows, it's not something about migration is either positive or negative, because obviously migration has positive and more negative implications depending on who you talk to and from whose perspective you're looking at. But I think the basic presumption out of a lot of policy is either an unwillingness or an inability to consider migration as a normal human process. Now, this is how I sort of try to visualize it. We have these much bigger processes of change, and migration is just one of the many parts of that change. So you cannot really divorce the analysis of migration of much bigger changes. I think the most obvious example of that new way of thinking, and in a way it's not new, but just to illustrate what I'm trying to say, is that think about the whole human experience of urbanization. Over the last 1 century to 1.5 centuries, almost any society in the world has either already completed or is in full transition from being this rural-based agrarian society towards being an urban-based industry and service sector society. That has gone along with large-scale movements of population from rural to urban areas. Now, it is very difficult to understand this whole process of urbanization without considering migration. But to the same extent, it is almost impossible to conceptualize and understand the modern migration experience without thinking about urbanization. So both processes are fundamentally intertwined with each other. So you cannot think the either away without the other. And that is one example, and I'll give another one for international migration later, that migration is often positively associated to development instead of being somehow the antithesis of development, which is very much part of the dominant frame. So we really need a fundamental rethink. Yeah, here there's a graph which clearly shows that as societies increase in wealth, the percentage of the population living in cities is going up. And of course, there's variations across society, but there is no one single society left in the world that is not urbanizing. So that is a very broad pattern. And of course, rural to urban migration is a big part of that movement. And although we talk a lot about international movements these days, I think it was briefly mentioned before, whether we talk about voluntary or forced migration, the large majority of people actually moves within countries. And to illustrate that need for a new paradigm, I will highlight 4 out of the 22 myths that I address in my book, which I think are some of the most important ones. But what is also interesting, that those myths or misconceptions exist both on the left and the right wing spectrum of politics. This is not exclusively a problem of far-right politics. I think a lot of these misconceptions about migration have become completely mainstreamed with all the best intentions, but still they lead to a fundamentally flawed analysis of the migration process. This is also true for education, and a lot of what is being said in universities about migration. And part of my mission within the academe is try to advocate this new paradigm and to really say we need a completely different way of thinking about migration if we are really to understand the process, and of course if we are to better manage migration without all the suffering and better results. Now, the first example, and I think this is the most widely shared conception about migration in the world, is that we live in times of unprecedented mass migration, and that migration is basically running out of hand. And this is very much reinforced by political rhetoric that often refers to immigration as an invasion, or in my country, the Netherlands, even as a tsunami that is threatening the very essence of Western societies, that are taking away valuable resources, welfare. And this is all sort of linked to this idea of the alleged massiveness of migration, and that borders are basically getting out of control. Now, this is very much influenced by images, like I said. This is an image of refugees that moved from Syria. I think this is taken in Hungary. And these kind of images have been used very effectively by certain political groups. For instance, this image was used in the Brexit campaign by the Leave Britain campaign that said, well, we cannot deal with these massive influxes anymore. This narrative is also pushed by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and I'm actually quite critical. I also address it in my book, of their framing of migration. Although without doubt with the best intentions, those and other humanitarian organizations try to draw attention for the plight of refugees. as the UNHCR used in its latest press release about new refugee data, stating that refugee migration has become untenable. They in a way play into the same narrative. So one of the discoveries I made while doing background research, that although political motivations may and institutional motives to run this narrative may widely differ. So on the far right, this narrative about mass migration may be used to justify measures as we currently see the Trump administration is implementing. Also, refugees and humanitarian organizations or development agencies often use this argument, or climate activists often use this argument. We say we need to do something because migration is running out of hand. So this is an interesting observation that this, notwithstanding the ideological or institutional or political interests involved, the common assumption that we live in this time of unprecedented mass migration actually is quite uncontested. And of course, tabloid headlines in the UK and other countries, of course, reinforce this constantly, and this is not a new story. But also quite serious academics, as my former colleague, Paul Collier, an Oxford development economist, wrote this book with a very suggestive title, and the image as well reinforces this idea that contemporary world migration is about a sort of increasingly massive emptying out of the so-called global south towards the global north. Also, this is a map that the United Nations Environmental Program published, but actually withdrew later from the internet, interestingly enough, to argue that climate change-related environmental degradation will lead to is already leading to massive migration, and will lead to increasingly massive migration in the future of perhaps hundreds of millions of people. Maps. I have also a geographer background, and maps are very effective tools of communication, but also very effective tools of manipulation. And I think this is an example of a Frontex map that shows what I call illegal border crossings. Now, we know the problem with those terminology, but leaving that aside, just the imagery of huge red arrows that point towards Europe reinforce the image that this is basically getting out of hand and that refugee inflows are simply overwhelming Western Europe. So whether we look at narratives from the right to the left, from humanitarian organizations to development agencies and from agencies like Frontex, everything seems to amalgamate to this idea of this massive migration or refugee crisis. And it's very tempting to believe it because we have this impression of increasing poverty, inequality, and violence in the world. On top of that, the argument seems quite solid that increasing means of communication and transport have it made easier for people to travel around the world. So also fleeing or migrating has become much easier. So it is very sort of intuitively, it seems correct. Well, there are some intellectual doubts about some of those arguments. For instance, why do we assume that better technology leads to more migration? Because we also know that better technology can allow people to work on distance, to commute from work to home, or to trade. These are all ways that migration could also be avoided. So there is an intellectual doubt to it, whether these kind of things automatically lead to more migration. And actually, if we look at long-term trends of violence, it's not that clear that we live in a more violent world than 30 or 40 years ago. So there are some intellectual doubts about the presumption that growing poverty, growing violence is leading, and better technology is leading to more migration. But let's first look at the data. Now, the best data we have is from the United Nations Population Division, UNDESA, and they published some very rough estimates about the total number of migrants living in the world. And here a migrant is simply a person who is born in another country than his or her current country of residence. And this includes refugees, irrespective of migration reasons. This is highly imperfect data. I think there are some reasonable questions that we could raise against the most recent estimates that have been published. But leaving quibbles about data aside, we see, of course, a clear increase from 1960 to 2070, from 90 million to over 250 million, and currently we have estimates around 300 million migrants worldwide. This obviously includes people who migrated as a baby, let's say from India to Pakistan, and never went back. So this is everybody. It does not include the second generation. But it's a rough estimate. And it seems to confirm this idea that migration is increasing fast. Well, as a good social scientist, if you want to know whether migration really is accelerating, you'd have to express that number also as a percentage of the world population. Now, once we do that, we get quite a different image because it's not only the total migrant population that increased, but also the world population overall. Now, when we look at the data in this way, and again, we can have endless quibbles about details, but it is pretty clear that migrants represent 3.5% of the world population. That is actually quite a remarkable fact. If we realize the problems that still persist in many parts of the world, what it means is that at least 90-60% of the world population is actually living in their countries of origin. And what shows a very simple fact that there's a very strong home bias. Despite violence, despite problems, the large majority of world population prefers to stay at home. There's another reason why international migration is not that high, and I'll come back to that. Migration is actually very expensive and requires a lot of resources. But it's sort of put in perspective that we live in a sort of accelerating migration moment. When we look at refugee data, also, we actually see a pattern that is very erratic. This is a graph using estimates by the UNHCR of global displacement. So this is not a total number of refugees in the world, but this is really refugee movements across borders. And basically, there's no pattern. And we can very clearly see that the big refugee movements, and the latest example is obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is very clearly tied to the outbreak of conflict. Well, you don't need to be a migration researcher to understand this, but I sometimes think in politics they better understand this fact when they talk about stopping refugee migration. Well, obviously, the best way to do that is to prevent conflict. But I think a more fundamental observation is there is no clear increase in the number of and the acceleration in the sort of relative numbers of refugees in the world. In fact, if we go back to the 1950s or 1960s, we have to observe that even absolute numbers of refugees were actually higher at that time in the post-war decades than they're right now. So there's no reason to assume that the global sort of refugee movements are running out of hand. Well, from a European perspective, of course, two big conflicts emerged in quite vicinity of Europe. And of course, from Western European perspective, this has meant over the last 10 to 15 years a growing number of refugees because simply there were a relatively high number of conflicts in the vicinity of Europe. And as we all know, the large majority of refugees, like migrants more generally, stay in their region. And this map was drawn before the Russian invasion. And this basically shows where most refugees live in the world. And 80 to 85% of refugees live in neighboring countries, in regions, basically. So there is also, and that percentage has remained also relatively stable. So there is no evidence that there is a growing sort of tide of migrants and refugees moving to Western countries. Now, these are kind of images we often see of, for instance, boats trying to cross the Mediterranean, and they reinforce an image that irregular migration is running out of hand. But also in that case, we have to see things into perspective. For instance, one statistic I share in my book is that 9 out of 10 Africans who migrate to Europe do so legally. Now, often when I present this to audiences, people are very surprised because what we see are those images of boats and people dying and suffering at borders. And without wanting to diminish the severity of those problems and the need to solve them, it is very important to keep seeing things into perspective. And I'll come back to that in the next point. So, and this gives the overall image. The large majority of the world population, roughly 83, at least 4 out of 5 people in the world, have never moved away from their home, basically. The large majority of migrants, roughly 4/5 of all migrants in the world, are people moving within their own country. To give one example, there are more internal migrants in China, the so-called floating population, than there are international migrants in the world. So migrants then is actually quite a small size of the world population, and refugees is about 1/10 of all migrants. So out of every 10 migrants, one is a refugee. So we actually see how infinitely small the refugee population is if we compare it to others. Of course, there are also internally displaced populations, but I think we have to, if we talk about international movement, we really have to focus on international border crossings. And of course, there's also many more internal migrants. But still, I think the most remarkable fact is that the vast majority of people in the world actually don't migrate. Perhaps that's the most interesting. And it forces us to rethink a lot of assumptions about migration already. Now, this is one of the maps in my book. And what I try to convey with this map is that the vast majority of people who move actually move to neighboring countries or move within their own continent. For instance, look at Africa or look at East and Southeast Asia. And that a relatively small percentage of movements is really about people switching from one continent to the other. So this whole image about a massive exodus from the global south to the global north is simply not backed up by the data. For instance, most Africans, the vast majority of Africans actually moves within the African continent to migration destinations within Africa, like Cote d'Ivoire, Gabon, South Africa, Libya, or Kenya. And I could give many more of these examples. So it's a much more complex pattern. Well, so the whole Exodus narrative or the invasion narrative, that's not really what we see. But at the same time, I think it would be very naive and also wrong to suggest nothing has changed. We have seen fundamental changes in world migration over the last half a century, but these have very little to do with a sort of global acceleration of numbers of migrants. This has everything to do with the dominant direction of global migration flows, in particularly from a European perspective. Because it have been obviously Europeans who, ever since the late 15th century, have been the ultimate emigrators. First, of course, as colonists, as missionaries, as plantation owners, and later as soldiers and ordinary migrants. It were Europeans who've moved to other parts in the world, particularly to the Americas, but since the 19th century, also increasingly to Africa and South and Southeast Asia. And colonization also led to the massive forced migration, for instance, of enslaved Africans, about 11 to 12 million, but also to recruitment of indentured laborers in South and Southeast Asia to British, Dutch, and French colonies. So it were Europeans who were the chief emigrators for almost 4 centuries to 5 centuries. And Europeans, in a way, established the modern world system. Now, a fundamental change has been since the 1950s and 60s that Europe, Western Europe, I should say, has transformed from a region of emigrants to a region of immigrants. Decolonization played a big role, but also fast economic growth, growing education levels of native populations, and a demographic change, so aging, increased growing labor shortages in Europe. And that meant that people from former colonies and other countries like in North Africa and Turkey started moving to Europe. So Europe, for the first time in its own history, was confronted with increasingly large-scale immigration from non-European countries to Europe. And of course, it's not surprising that this has generated a lot of debate in Europe and also a fair share of xenophobia. It had all fundamental consequences for migration to the United States. Of course, for a country like the United States, or Canada, or Australia, or New Zealand, immigration as such is nothing new. But what has changed is that with the drying up of Europe as a prime source of migrants, immigration to the United States, for instance, became increasingly Latin American and also Asian. So the background, the ethnicity of migrants has fundamentally changed compared to a century ago. And of course, also in the case of the United States, this has led to quite some xenophobia and political reactions and also understandable debate about this issue. So this is really not about numbers. It is primarily about the changing the geography of world migration. I often call this a global migration reversal. But what it reveals is a very Eurocentric perspective. Well, this picture shows, for instance, for Western Europe, that the immigrant-born, foreign-born population has increased. On average, in Western Europe, we have roughly 15% of the population being an immigrant, and roughly half of those migrants came from non-European countries. Now, again, if you go back a century ago, relative levels of immigration in North America were as high as now, but what we see clearly in the graph that the non-European share of immigrants in the United States and Canada has vastly increased. And this is exactly where we are talking about. So an undeniable change. But this has primarily been about legal migration, regular migration, mainly driven by labor shortages. So this idea that migration is running out of hand, we see more and more irregular migration, that refugee numbers are increasing fast, particularly if you look at the long term, it's actually not backed up by the data, and we need a much more nuanced perspective. What about this other idea? And this seems to make a lot of sense. You make it more difficult to cross a border, and we may have debates about whether it's ethically or morally justified to have border controls and all the suffering it creates, but many politicians say, well, this is a necessary evil. We don't really have a choice. And it seems to make sense. You make it more difficult to cross the border. Costs and risk are going up. So you'd have to reduce the inflow, right? It seems to make a lot of sense. And this is the situation in which we've been now for 3 to 4 decades. In the US, ever since 1986, we have seen an increased investment in border enforcement. This is really not Trump's invention. It went back to Reagan. Clinton administrations had already started to build those fences. So this has been a long-term effort to stop migration to the United States. And we see a quasi-militarization of borders. Some pictures taken a few years ago here about Haitian migrants and refugees who were being stopped at the border. But also on the European side, this is the Spanish-Moroccan border, close to Melilla, northern Morocco. We see the creation of fences and again, the quasi-militarization of borders. This goes back to 1991. Not everybody is aware of that because in a way, what we often see in politics is that a lot of the same policies being reinvented as something new, but all the way back to 1991, we see actually the militarization of borders ever since Southern European countries introduced visas for many African passport holders. And we can now, I should update this, we can now speak about 34 years of migration deals between the EU and several North and West African countries in efforts to outsource migration controls. And the narrative is often, we have no choice. These people may have reasons to come, but we're simply being overwhelmed, so we have to do something. It is a necessary evil. Well, to me, apart from the moral and ethical debate, and I would never like to suggest that we don't need that debate too, I would like to focus on one thing. Do these policies actually work in the first place? And if we look at the science, if we look at the enormous amounts of research that has been done on this topic, the effectivity of migration controls actually shows that in many cases, border restrictions that were misguided and not based on a real understanding of migration often lead to more migration, certainly permanent migration instead of less. That sounds almost incredible. But the problem is because of this one-sided focus on people coming in and a lack of understanding of what drives migration, if we really want to understand what the effect of immigration policies is, we have to understand that migration is not just a process of coming, but of coming and going. And this is what migration researchers refer to as circulation. If migration is free, and we see that between countries that have now immigration restrictions, like within the European Union, we see it, of course, for migration within countries, that migration is an extremely fluid process where people just go back and forth as opportunities arise, as people try out new lives, as people flee difficulties, but often return once those difficulties are over. And so migration tends to be very circular process of coming and going. So the real question is what happens if you make that circulation more difficult? And here we see a lot of unintended effects of migration policies. First of all, obviously, if people still have reasons to move, what we often see is that migration simply goes underground. And that migrants start to rely increasingly on smuggling. And there is a bitter irony in the idea that by increasing border controls, we can sort of combat smuggling. A very belligerent terminology is used by politicians, but in many ways, smuggling is not the cause of irregular migration. Smuggling is a form of service delivery, a market that emerges once governments try to stop people from moving, but people still have good motives to move. And in a way, that is also why the so-called fight against smuggling is almost bound to fail, because it's among the very causes of the problem it pretends to solve. It makes migration obviously much more dangerous, but it doesn't stop it. And that's clearly what we've seen over the last 3 to 4 decades. Another effect is the constant relocation of migration routes. And I've traced this myself. The Dutch call this the waterbed effect. So if you push on one point, the flow simply moves to another place. And this is what happened with African migration to Europe, because initially, if we go back to the 1990s, most North and West Africans who wanted to move to Europe irregularly, they used the Strait of Gibraltar. That's only 15 miles separating Europe and Africa. As controls went up there, we see a relocation of attempted crossing points up to the Canary Islands and so forth, and of course, more recently also through the Eastern Mediterranean. So again, it didn't solve the problem. It expanded the area where controls needed to be necessary, and all experts agree that it is virtually impossible to seal off the Mediterranean unless we want to transform the European Union in a kind of totalitarian state. Of course, the other sad consequence has been the increased cost and also human risks being taken, with numbers of people dying on European borders increasing, and the Mediterranean is by far the most lethal border in the world. Same happened in the US, Mexican context, where migrants have taken increasing risks in terms to cross borders. But in a way, the most important issue is actually not irregular migration, because as I mentioned before, it is not as massive as we often suggest. Actually, the biggest unintended counterproductive effects of border controls have been on legal migration. First of all, we have the phenomenon of preemptive migration searches. If migrants know, and refugees know, that borders may be closed in the future, many people take a preemptive measure to cross the border now before it's too late. A very good example is the country of Suriname. Used to be a Dutch colony, but the Dutch state tried to make the country independent in the 1970s. And the real motive was not so much a sort of post-colonial or anti-colonial ideology. It was actually to stop free migration of Surinamese citizens to the Netherlands, because before independence, Suriname was full part of the Dutch kingdom and all Surinamese were Dutch passport holders. This created a push for the Dutch government to push Suriname out of the kingdom and to make the country independent, because the only way they thought to stop migration was to de-Dutchify the Surinamese. So what we see here is the date of independence, and we see migration going up from Suriname. Now, with this impending deadline of independence and later visas being introduced, a lot of Surinamese thought it is now or it is never. And we saw a huge migration peak around independence and a second migration peak when visas were introduced. And over the time span of about 10 years, 40% of the entire population moved permanently to the Netherlands. There are also more recent examples. I'll briefly come back to that. Brexit is not a great example, with migration quadrupling after Britain left the European Union, because many migrants from Eastern Europe decided to stay put instead of return in the United Kingdom. So we have to understand in more intuitive terms, free migration is a kind of revolving door. And what often happens when unintended migration restrictions are being introduced, basically migrants are being held on the other side of the border. So they no longer want to go back because they fear not to be able to migrate again. We've actually measured this. What happens quantitatively if you introduce a visa in a formerly free migration area? Well, you reduce inflows, the number of people coming, by about 2/3, basically reduce return flows by almost 90%. Actually, what it means on average, you end up with more migrants. This is exactly what happened in the US. So increasing border enforcement since 1986 in the US turned a largely circular flow of Mexicans going back and forth to California, Texas, and a few other US states in a permanently settled migrant population of about 12 million. And when migrant workers decide to settle because they're no longer there to go back, they will get their family members also to join them. So it creates actually an additional multiplier in terms of numbers of migrants. So you lock up migrants at the receiving end of the border. Exactly the same happened in Europe. Ever since the guest worker era in the 1960s and 70s, we see migration continuing and returns actually stop. So migrants are being pushed in permanent settlement. So this is how migration does not work. Migration policy is not a tap you can just turn on and off at will, because migrants have their own agency. Let me skip this one. It's on the wrong place. So what it shows is that, or no, why I showed it is the following reason, is that there are very important drivers of migration. And as long as we don't address those drivers, we see that in all sorts of ways, migrants will still, and refugees will still find ways of crossing borders. And this insight is not new. We often hear the following argument, and particularly we hear this from humanitarian actors. Yes, indeed, immigration restrictions over the last 30 to 40 years have not been able to stop legal or illegal migration. They have pushed migrants into permanent settlement. The same so for refugees. They have also pushed refugees and prospective work migrants in underground migration routes. It has made them more vulnerable, and it has led to increasing suffering. So the argument is often, we need development in poor countries. This is the only way we can reduce this migration. And we can find this back time and again in the press. Like a few years ago, Angela Merkel proposed, and this was in response, this was already 10 years ago actually, she responded to another migration crisis in the Canary Islands by saying, we need a Marshall Plan for Africa. Also, the Biden administration had this program to address the so-called root causes of migration. And this is the root causes narrative that is very prevalent. And it seems to make a lot of sense. And it sounds very humanitarian and more plausible that this is the only long-term solution for this problem. However, there are some problems with this narrative. First of all, it taps to in a kind of desperate departure stereotype. It portrays migrants unilaterally as victims of poverty, of conflict, of smugglers, of traffickers, of abusive border agents, without taking into account their agency. Of course, that doesn't mean that there is no victimhood or that there are no cases in which migrants are clearly desperate. But I think it is not representative for the overall knowledge we have about migration. Because migration, by and large, if we look at the evidence, is an investment in the better future of countries. And we have good reasons to assume that the poorest of the poorest actually migrate much less than people who are slightly better off. And there's a lot of evidence also based on my own fieldwork in Morocco in particular. When I was doing that fieldwork, I saw many paradoxes that made me question already a long time ago lots of our assumptions about migration. Well, this is a graph that shows two things. The first graph I will run, if my PowerPoint works, is economic development in Morocco. And this is on the right-hand side. This is in dollars. So this is income per head of the population, corrected for inflation and all of these things. And what we basically see is that Morocco has become 3 times wealthier per capita of the population than it was in the 1960s. And if we look at all other development indicators like education, like life expectancy, there has been huge progress. So you would expect somehow, as Morocco has become less poor, that we see less migration. Well, the next graph shows outflows from Morocco, so numbers of Moroccans leaving Morocco, and we clearly see no decreasing trend. On the longer term, we rather see an increasing trend. So how is this possible? Morocco became much less poor and much better off in many ways, but Moroccans still kept on migrating. And this forces us to really rethink this assumption that it is really underdevelopment and deprivation that pushes migration. Because migration, as I mentioned earlier, is expensive. Migration requires a lot of resources, whether it's economic resources, whether it's knowledge, skills, diplomas, they all increase people's chance to migrate. And migration is this investment. It is very expensive actually to migrate. I recently did research in Senegal amongst fisher communities, and the boats they use to, for instance, go to the Canary Islands are very big fisher boats. And these cost at least 50,000 euros. So in order to be able to invest in this kind of migration, you actually need quite some capital. That is not something the poorest of the poorest can do. And that just look around the world, what are the most important immigration countries? Well, if we look in Europe, think about a country like Poland, for instance. Is that a really poor country? I wouldn't say so. If we look globally, Mexico, Turkey, the Philippines, these are not amongst the poorest countries in the world. These are quintessential immigration countries. Well, that is not a coincidence. And there has been already a number of older theories that have argued this, that development, so increasing education, decreasing poverty, urbanization, development of infrastructure actually leads to more migration, not to less migration. So to test this theory, 15 years ago already, I wrote a paper where I tried to test and to look at patterns in terms of if you arrange all the countries in the world, ranging from very low levels of development to very high levels of development, what patterns do we see? Now, the first graph is about the number of immigrants you see in a country as countries develop. And this shows a very intuitive pattern that very poor countries with a very low score on the Human Development Index have only 3% of the population as an immigrant, and rich countries have about 15% of the population being an immigrant. But if we look at emigration, the number of people leaving, we see a completely counterintuitive pattern that defies all these ideas about that migration is primarily driven by deprivation and by poverty. In fact, extreme poverty prevents people from moving. And the most vulnerable populations, the biggest victims in a way of environmental threats, of political threats, of violence, of economic deprivation are those who are not able to move out of dangerous situations. So it's typically the middle income groups that tend to have the highest level of migration. And it fundamentally questions all these models that are often summarized as a push-pull model, which is a very stereotypical representation of migration. Now, in order to explain this, and I saw actually the advert of this conference. I think this kind of imagery, if I may, could be criticized as giving a very one-sided perspective of migration, as a sort of flight. Yeah, this happens, and I understand why these images are being used, but it also may recreate certain stereotypes, particularly amongst Western populations, that don't necessarily do a service to a proper understanding of migration and taking away unjustified fears, if I'm allowed to make that comment. So how can we explain this? To explain this paradox, I wrote a paper a few years ago where I tried to develop a new paradigm, a new theory of migration, where I tried to argue that we need to conceptualize human mobility as a function of the capabilities and aspirations of people to move. And what typically happens once people get access to some resources, poverty decreases, get access to education, information, their life aspirations start to change completely, often towards more urban-based and consumerist lifestyles, away from traditional rural agrarian lifestyles. And at the same time, it improves their capabilities to move. And that can explain why we actually see this very paradoxical pattern. So what it means is that we need to fundamentally reframe migration, not somehow as the antithesis of development, but in many ways. And here I'm quoting one of my mentors, the Scottish migration researcher, Ronald Skeldon. Migration is in many ways development. We have to get away from this pathologizing view of migration as a problem to be fixed. That does not mean that migration cannot come with its share of problems, but it is a fundamental wrong starting point, ignoring all the evidence if we somehow believe that development will solve the issue. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll keep this short. So this begs the question, what is the real cause of migration? Well, of course, there are many causes of migration. As I mentioned before, it's quite obvious that conflict is a cause of migration, but we have to keep in mind this is a relatively small share of the total world migrant population, which by definition should alleviate fears. This is really about numbers. But the other big driver that is barely ever addressed in all the narratives we hear about either migrants as a threat or migration as a development problem to be fixed is that the single biggest driver of world migration has been labor demand. And this completely contradicts his other familiar myth that migrants steal jobs and drive down wages. Actually, you have to reverse the whole causality. Almost all big migration, apart from refugee emergencies, have been produced by efforts by industries, mines, and other employers in destination states to recruit workers. Whether we look at the guest worker migration to Europe, when we look at more recent migration to Europe, whether we look at Mexican migration to the US, but also more recent migration, it is really labor shortages that has driven migration. In other words, migrants don't take jobs, they fill vacancies. And just a few graphs to illustrate this, I could draw this graph for many countries, but I did it for my own, the Netherlands. One graph shows, the orange one, economic growth, and the blue graph shows net migration. Excluding temporary protection of Ukrainians, I'm really filtering out refugee component here. And we see a clear correlation. If the economy is doing well, lots of migrants come. If the economy is doing bad, not many migrants come, and actually many go back. We see it even clearer if we plot unemployment against migration. It very clearly shows that both almost mirror each other. If unemployment is high, why would many migrants bother coming? And if unemployment is low and labor shortages are high, many migrants are coming. One other way to plot this is job openings. So unfulfilled job vacancies and net migration is an almost perfect correlation. By the way, we see the same with irregular border crossings in the US. So the steep increase of irregular border crossings wasn't only driven by problems in origin countries, but certainly also by the huge opportunities there were during the post-COVID labor crunch. And I think this is, in a way, the elephant in the room of the entire migration debate. I would say the political hypocrisy around migration is largely driven by the unwillingness of politicians to acknowledge that migrant workers are doing all sorts of useful jobs, but instead prefer to blame migrants for problems they haven't caused. So there's a huge gap between the political rhetoric and the policy practice. So where does this leave us? The Brexit conundrum, that's the last thing before I conclude. I think Brexit illustrates in a way everything. You see the same photo reappearing I showed earlier. The quest to take back control, as British politicians called it, was a major, or perhaps arguably the most important reason for people to vote in favor of Brexit. And it seemed to make a lot of sense. Because politicians argued, well, the only way to stop free inflows of migrants from Eastern Europe is to get out of the European Union. It is a reverse case of the Netherlands kicking out Suriname from the Dutch kingdom. Only by no longer being a member of the European Union, we can stop this. It seemed to make a lot of sense. And politicians in the UK talked a lot about bringing down migration. David Cameron promised no ifs, no buts, but I will keep net migration under the 100,000. And as I just argued, Brexit vote was a very, very important factor behind migration was a very important factor behind the Brexit vote. What did we see? Migration quadrupled after Brexit. This had many causes, but the main cause was that labor demand only shot up after Brexit and certainly after the end of the COVID pandemic. And many migrants who were only thought to be temporarily in the UK actually settled permanently and got their family members over. So it's one last example of how migration had totally counterproductive effects. Well, let me say last few words about what can we do, because it is nice to see how things didn't work, how we misunderstand things. I think there's two main issues and two main unresolved issues in terms of immigration policy. The first one is refugees. I think it is quite clear that this is not about numbers. I think the relative willingness of Western European nations to host Ukrainian refugees a few years ago, actually, and in much bigger numbers than refugees coming from other areas of the world, actually shows this is not about numbers, but about political willingness. I think it is a crisis of solidarity, a solidarity between countries, for instance, within the European Union, where some countries like Germany and Austria, I think had good reasons to not be happy about the lack of willingness of other countries to sort of share the responsibility of hosting refugees. And this also goes for regions within countries. But of course, the European Union, to take that example, with 450 million people, could deal with this if there was some reasonable level of burden sharing in this thing. So it is really a crisis of solidarity. There's much more to be said about this, but this is not primarily a crisis of numbers. The other thing is lower skilled labor migrants. I think this is a huge problem. We have tough talking politicians, both in Europe and in the United States and many other destination countries. But at the same time, we have this hypocrisy where politicians are all too willing to turn a blind eye towards the exploitation of migrant workers and undocumented migrant workers in particular. We also see this dynamic very recently in the United States, where Donald Trump suddenly backed away from raiding workplaces because, of course, employers lobby to allow the situation to continue. So what we see is that we've entered an era of neoliberal immigration policy, where we treat migrants as an expendable workforce and we don't consider migrants as people. And here I would like to quote the Swiss writer Max Frisch, who back in the 1970s, 60s already said, we wanted workers, we got people instead. And the consistent failure of destination governments to see migrants as people and their reduction to an expendable workforce was the cause of many problems with segregation later on and will so be in the future, unless we are able to recognize this real demand for lower migrant workers and to organize an immigration system that gives those workers proper rights. And that requires a real debate about the kind of economy we want in the future, the kind of society we want to live in. Unless we have this debate, we can never have a serious debate. So in other terms, a real debate about migration is by definition a debate about the kind of society we would like to live in. Thank you very much.